The turkeys found the water just as the sun cracked the horizon, turning the dust in the air to a haze of old gold. There were 87 of them now, a hobbling, scratching, ridiculous army. And they had converged on a patch of baked clay that looked no different from any other acre of Elara's useless land. They scratched not with the idle, wandering motion of birds looking for grubs, but with a unified, frantic purpose, their thick legs pumping, their splayed claws scoring the packed earth in a rhythmic frenzy. A low, resonant thump echoed from beneath the ground, a sound no one had heard in Cinder Creek for 100 years. The sounds of a hollow place. Elara stood watching, her hands raw from the pickaxe she'd been wielding beside them, her heart a tight drum in her chest. Behind her, on the rise that marked the edge of her property, the town was gathering. They stood in a silent line, their faces pinched with thirst and disbelief. It was Hemlock who had laughed the loudest 6 months before. Now his silence was the loudest thing on the prairie. He stood beside the Miller family whose well had gone dry yesterday, and his prize cattle were skeletons rattling in his north pasture. And all of them, the mockers and the pitied, were watching the lame birds Elara had bought for $14, watching them unearth a miracle from the dust they had all written off as dead. 6 months earlier, the dust had been just as thick, but the laughter had been easy. Elara Vance stood alone at the back of the crowd for the county auction. She had her inheritance clutched in a sweaty palm. $20, all that was left after her father's debts were settled. He had left her the quarter section of land everyone called the boneyard, a place so hard and unforgiving the coyotes had to pack a lunch to cross it. She was 22, a woman alone, and the town of Cinder Creek looked at her with a pity so sharp it felt like scorn. A shame, they'd murmur at the general store. A young woman alone can't run a place like that. They were waiting for her to fail, to sell the boneyard to Hemlock for pennies on the dollar and move on. Elara, however, was her father's daughter, which meant she was stubborn as bedrock and saw the world through the lens of quiet arithmetic. The auctioneer was working his way through the last of the lots, dispirited horses, a few scabby sheep. Then came the turkeys. They were a sorry sight, a flock of broad-breasted bronzes, but they'd been kept in a cramped, damp pen, and a rot had gotten into their feet. They limped and stumbled, their magnificent chests held low to the ground in a posture of permanent apology. 90 birds, the auctioneer boomed, trying to inject life into the sale. A fine flock for a patient hand. Who'll start me at $50? Silence. A gust of wind sent a dust devil spinning through the crowd. Hemlock, the cattle agent whose own land bordered hers, let out a low chuckle. "You'd do better to buy the cage and burn the birds, Jed," he called out, and the men around him laughed. The price dropped. 40, 30, 20. $15 for the lot, the auctioneer pleaded. 14? Elara's hand shot up. A ripple went through the crowd. Not a gasp of surprise, but a wave of wary confirmation. There it is, their faces said. The first mistake. The beginning of the end. Hemlock turned to look at her, a slow, condescending smile spreading across his face. "Well now, Miss Vance, going to start a hospital for crippled poultry?" Elara met his gaze, her expression as flat and unreadable as the hard pan she called home. She walked to the clerk, counted out the 14 worn dollar bills, and accepted the receipt. One person alone, with 90 lame birds and $6 to her name. The arithmetic was stark. It had to be enough. Getting them home was a pilgrimage of absurdity, a 3-mile walk, chaperoning a flock of birds that moved with the pained, lurching gait of 100 tiny old men. They did not flock so much as they oozed across the landscape. a slow, feathered tide of misery. The town watched from their porches. No one offered a wagon. Their expressions were a blend of amusement and a kind of grim satisfaction. They were witnessing the proof of their own judgment. Elara walked behind them, a long switch in her hand, not for striking but for gently guiding the stragglers. She spoke to them in a low, steady murmur, the same tone she'd heard her father use on spooked horses. "Easy now. Just a little further. There's water ahead." It was a lie for now. Her own well was shallow, barely a seep, but it was more than they had. She felt the weight of the town's eyes on her back, a physical pressure. Being right is its own kind of reply, her father used to say, but being wrong, in a place like this, was a public spectacle. It was Mrs. Gable who broke the wall of silence. The old woman sat on her porch, her face a road map of wrinkles, her hands busy shelling peas into a metal bowl. She had come from the old country, a place of hard soil and harder lessons. As Elara and her limping convoy passed, she called out, her voice thin but clear as a bell. "They are heavy on the ground, child." Elara stopped, grateful for a voice without mockery in it. "Yes, ma'am." "Their feet are sore." Mrs. Gable nodded, her eyes not on Elara but on the birds themselves. "Good. The earth speaks to those who are heavy upon it. The land keeps its secrets for the ones who listen with their feet." It made no sense, but the words were a balm. Elara nodded her thanks and moved on. It took her 4 hours to cover the 3 miles. By the time she got the turkeys into the rickety pen behind her small cabin, the sun was setting. She drew bucket after bucket of precious water, filling their troughs. Then, by the light of a single lantern, she began the real work. She took them one by one, holding their heavy bodies in her lap, and examined their feet. The pads were swollen, cracked and hot to the touch. She did the arithmetic in her head. 90 birds, 2 feet per bird, 180 problems to solve. She had $6, a half sack of cornmeal, and a patch of land that grew rocks better than it grew grass. She cleaned the first bird's feet with a rag dipped in precious water, her touch gentle. The turkey, a big tom with a regal if pained disposition, settled into her lap, making a low guttural purr. It was not a sound of defeat. It was a sound of trust. The work was methodical, a rhythm that shaped her days. Before the sun rose, she was out, grinding corn, mixing it with lard and crushed yarrow she found growing in the shade of the rocks. She fashioned a thick, soothing poultice. Then she would begin the slow, patient process of tending to the flock. She sat on a low stool in the pen, and one by one, the birds would come to her. They seemed to understand. They would stand with a stoic dignity while she cleaned the sores and applied the greasy balm, wrapping their feet in strips of old flour sacking. The townsfolk riding past on the main road would sometimes stop and watch the strange ritual. A woman in a dusty yard, surrounded by dozens of bandaged birds. The joke around town was that Elara Vance wasn't raising turkeys. She was running a sanatorium. The only visitor who came with curiosity instead of judgment was Tom Miller, a boy of 10 with eyes that missed nothing. He'd perch on the fence rail for hours, silent, watching. "What's his name?" he asked one afternoon, pointing at the big tom she was treating. "He doesn't have a name," Elara said, concentrating on her work. "He should," the boy insisted. "He looks like a general." Elara looked at the turkey. He did have a certain battered authority. "All right," she said. "General Scrabble." A slow grin spread across Tom's face. From that day on, he became the flock's official christener. There was Mrs. Waddle, a hen with an impressively pendulous snood, Patches, who had a bald spot on his back, and a trio of nearly identical toms he named Hop, Skip, and Jump, a name of gentle irony that made Elara smile. The boy's presence was a small comfort, a quiet alliance against the town's collective certainty. He never laughed at the birds. He saw them as she did, not as a mistake, but as a project. As the weeks passed, a change began. The swelling in their feet went down. The limping became less pronounced. The flour sack bandages came off, revealing clean pink skin. Their feathers, once dull and dusty, took on the iridescent sheen of bronze and copper. They began to carry themselves differently. Their heads held high, their powerful chests puffed out. They were no longer a shuffling mob of invalids, but a flock, proud and cohesive. They followed Elara around the yard like a phalanx of loyal, if slightly clumsy soldiers. Mrs. Gable's words echoed in her mind. The earth speaks to those who are heavy upon it. She began to let them range further, out onto the baked hardpan of the boneyard. And that's when she noticed their strange obsession. They were drawn to a slight depression in the land, a wide, shallow basin of clay, so hard, a mule's hoof barely left a mark. They spent hours there, not pecking, but scratching. It was a different kind of scratch from their usual search for insects. It was a deep, rhythmic, almost violent scraping, their powerful legs working like pistons, their claws gouging at the compacted earth. Day after day they returned to the same spot, a circle perhaps 50 feet across, and worked it over. At first, Elara thought it was a mineral deficiency, some salt deep in the clay they craved. She watched them, her brow furrowed in thought. The sound they made was distinctive, a steady shuff scrape that became the background music to her life. While the turkeys scratched, the sky remained a flat, unforgiving blue. April bled into May, and May into a blistering June, and no rain came. The creek that gave the town its name shrank from a flow to a trickle, then to a series of stagnant, muddy pools. The pastures on the good land, Hemlock's land, turned from green to pale straw. The corn in the miller's field grew stunted and yellowed before it could tassel. A quiet tension settled over Cinder Creek. The easy laughter of the auction house was gone, replaced by clipped conversations and worried glances at the sky. Elara felt it too. Her well was dropping, the water she pulled each morning cloudier than the day before. The arithmetic was changing. Her $6 were long gone, spent on corn and supplies. Her survival now depended entirely on the birds. She had started gathering their eggs, which they laid in prodigious numbers. They were larger than any chicken egg she'd ever seen, with thick, speckled shells and yolks the color of a summer sunset. She ate them fried, boiled and scrambled, and felt their richness seep into her bones. She was healthier than she'd been in years. The turkeys, now sleek and strong, were thriving on the very land that was starving everyone else. They seemed to find sustenance where there was none, growing fat on weeds, grasshoppers, and whatever secrets they were scratching from the clay. One afternoon, Mrs. Gable stopped by, her wagon loaded with empty water barrels. She watched the birds at their work in the basin. "They are digging for you," she said, her voice full of a strange certainty. "What for?" Elara asked. The old woman smiled, a crinkling of her eyes. "The land remembers. It remembers the rain. Sometimes it saves a little for a dry day. You just have to know where to ask." Elara looked from the scratching birds to the old woman's serene face. It still felt like nonsense, but it was a hopeful kind of nonsense, and hope was in shorter supply than water. By the end of June, the secret could no longer be kept. The turkeys were laying more eggs than she could possibly eat. She had baskets full of them, stored in the cool darkness of her small root cellar. Keeping them hidden felt like hoarding treasure, a coal banked low under ash. She knew she had to sell them, but the thought of facing the town, of offering them the fruits of her supposed folly, filled her with a deep unease. It was easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The opportunity came in the form of a stranger, a cook for a wealthy merchant in the capital, whose wagon had thrown a wheel just outside of town. While it was being fixed, he wandered into the general store, complaining about the quality of provisions. "Can a man find a decent egg in this forsaken place?" he grumbled to anyone who would listen. The storekeeper, Mr. Harris, just shrugged. "Hens aren't laying much in this heat." It was Tom Miller, there on an errand for his mother, who spoke up. "Miss Vance has eggs," he said, his voice small but clear. "The best eggs." The cook looked down at the boy, then over at Harris, who gave a non-committal grunt. A flicker of curiosity crossed the man's face. He followed Tom's directions out to the boneyard. He found Elara separating the newest eggs by size, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. He introduced himself, his city clothes looking out of place against the backdrop of dust and scratching turkeys. "The boy said you have eggs for sale." Elara hesitated for only a moment. Then she nodded and led him to the cellar. She held up the lantern. The light fell on basket after basket of large, mottled eggs. The cook let out a low whistle. "My word." He picked one up, feeling its surprising weight. "I'll take 2 dozen. Elara named a fair price, a good price, but not a gouging one. The cook paid without haggling. That evening he sought her out again. He had cooked some of the eggs at his camp. His face was alight with a convert's zeal. "Madam, I have never tasted such an egg. The yolk, it is like cream. The flavor, it is of the earth itself. My employer, Mr. Abernathy, he will pay a premium for eggs of this quality. A standing order. Whatever you can spare." He pressed a crisp $10 bill into her hand as a down payment. When his wagon was fixed the next morning, he took 5 dozen with him, packed carefully in a crate of sawdust. The sight of the fancy city man loading crates at Elara Vance's place did not go unnoticed. The whispers started. The arithmetic in Elara's head began to feel less like a prayer and more like a plan. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The creek bed was a cracked gray scar on the landscape. The leaves on the cottonwoods turned brittle and fell, littering the ground in a mockery of autumn. The town's communal well, the one they all relied on when their private ones failed, dropped so low that drawing water became a day-long chore for a few muddy buckets. The sound of thirsty cattle became a constant, mournful chorus. Hemlock's herd, his pride and the source of his wealth, suffered the most. They stood listlessly in his parched fields, their ribs showing like barrel staves, their eyes dull with thirst. He had money, but money couldn't make it rain. He grew short-tempered, his smooth condescension curdling into a raw, angry frustration. The town's mood soured with the weather. Scorn for Elara and her turkeys was a luxury they could no longer afford. It was replaced by a simmering resentment, a jealousy that had no name. She, on her barren patch of land, seemed untouched by the catastrophe. Her well, though low, still gave water. Her birds were fat and healthy. The rumor of her lucrative egg business had spread, magnified with each telling. They didn't know the half of it. The standing order from the city cook had become her lifeline, a steady stream of income that allowed her to buy corn and supplies from a town 30 miles away, avoiding the resentful eyes in Cinder Creek. She worked from dawn until dusk. Her world shrunk to the rhythms of her flock and the demands of the parched earth. She felt the change in how the town saw her. Their silence was no longer pitying. It was watchful, accusatory. as if her small success was somehow stolen from their collective misfortune. One evening, Hemlock rode up to her fence line. He didn't dismount, sitting high on his horse, looking down at her and her flock. "Your well still holding?" he asked, his voice rough. "For now," Elara said, not stopping her work of scattering the evening feed. "Mine's about gone," he said. It wasn't an admission of weakness. It was a veiled threat. "My cattle are dying." He stared at her, his eyes narrowed. "Funny how this worthless piece of ground is doing better than the best pasture in the county. Some might find that unnatural." Elara met his gaze, her own as steady as a stone. "The birds work hard." "The birds," he sneered, a flicker of the old mockery returning. He looked over at the basin where the flock was still scratching, their obsession having grown more intense as the ground grew harder. "Still digging for China, are they?" He wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving a cloud of bitter dust in his wake. The encounter left Elara with a cold knot in her stomach. The arithmetic of survival was no longer just about food and water. It was now about the envy of desperate men. By the third week of August, Elara's own well began to fail. The water she drew was thick with mud, and there was less of it each morning. The arithmetic turned grim again. Without water for the flock, everything she had built would turn to dust. The birds seemed to sense the urgency. Their scratching in the basin became a frantic, ceaseless activity. The circle they had been working on for months was now scraped bare, a wide disk of exposed pale clay, scored with 1,000,000 tiny lines. The sound of it kept her awake at night, a desperate, rhythmic scraping that was both a torment and a strange comfort. It was the sound of effort, of hope against hope. One morning she rose before dawn, a new resolve hardening inside her. Mrs. Gable's words came back to her. "They are digging for you." She had dismissed it as folklore, but what did she have to lose? She took her father's old pickaxe from the shed, its hickory handle smooth from his hands, and walked out to the basin. The turkeys parted for her, a silent, expectant audience. She swung the pickaxe, bringing it down in the center of their circle. The impact sent a jarring shock up her arms. The ground was like iron. She swung again and again, chips of dry clay flying. The birds watched, their heads cocked. For an hour she worked, sweat stinging her eyes, her muscles screaming. The sun rose, beating down on her back. It was useless, the ground was impenetrable. Exhausted and defeated, she let the pickaxe fall. It landed head first, its sharp point burying itself in the ground. And then she heard it. A sound different from the solid thud of steel on clay. It was a deep, resonant thump, a hollow sound. A thrill sharp as lightning shot through her. She dropped to her knees, scrabbling at the dirt with her bare hands. The turkeys surged around her, scratching with renewed vigor, as if they knew. Her fingers found a straight edge, cool and smooth beneath the dust. A line. She dug faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It was stone, a massive, flat slab of dressed sandstone, fitted together with the precision of a master mason. She had found a seam. Working with the point of the pickaxe, she scraped the clay from the crack, uncovering the edges of a massive circular lid. It took her another hour to clear the whole thing. It was a stone circle, 10 feet across, with a heavy iron ring set in its center. It was a cistern cap, an old one from a time before the town, before the wells, from a time when people knew how to save what the sky gave them. She wedged the head of the pickaxe under the iron ring and heaved with all her might. Nothing. She tried again, putting her back into it, her feet braced against the stone. The lid groaned, scraping against its seat. A crack of darkness appeared. From it rose a smell she had almost forgotten. The smell of cool, damp earth. The smell of deep water. She worked the lid open just enough to see inside. The darkness below was absolute, but the air that wafted up was cool and clean, carrying the scent of stone and water untouched by the sun. She lowered a bucket on a rope, her hands trembling. It seemed to fall forever before it landed with a soft, distant splash that echoed in the stone chamber. The sound was the sweetest music she'd ever heard. She hauled it up, hand over hand, the rope growing heavy. The bucket that emerged was full to the brim with water so clear it looked like liquid air. She dipped her cupped hands into it and drank. It was cold, clean, and utterly pure. It tasted of life itself. The turkeys crowded around, their thirst making them bold. Dipping their heads into the bucket, she laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened relief, and drew another bucket and another, filling their troughs until they overflowed, creating dark, muddy patches on the baked clay. For a day, the secret was hers alone. It was a dizzying power. She had water. In a world dying of thirst, she had an ocean beneath her feet. She calculated the size of the cistern. If it was as deep as it was wide, it held thousands of gallons, enough for her, her flock, and more. The arithmetic had inverted. She was no longer the poorest person in Cinder Creek. She was the richest. The knowledge was a heavy weight. The next afternoon, Tom Miller appeared at the fence line, his face streaked with dust, his shoulders slumped. "Our well's dry, Miss Vance," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Not muddy. Dry. Mama's been crying." Elara looked at the boy and beyond him at the haze of dust over the town. She saw the faces of the people who had mocked her, who had pitied her, who had waited for her to fail. She could charge them anything she wanted. $1 a bucket? $5. They would pay. They would have to. But then she saw Mrs. Gable's face, her kind, knowing eyes. She saw Tom, who had given her flock names and her a measure of companionship. She looked at General Scrabble, who was preening nearby, his feathers gleaming. They had not scratched for profit. They had scratched for survival. She filled a bucket from the cistern and handed it over the fence to the boy. "Take this to your mother. Tell her there's more here." The boy stared at the bucket as if it were a miracle, then back at her, his eyes wide with a gratitude so profound it was heartbreaking. As he ran off, another figure appeared on the road. Hemlock. He had seen. He rode up slowly, his eyes not on her, but on the dark, wet circle around the cistern opening, on the full troughs, on the water dripping from the bucket in his hand, where she'd just drawn more. His face was a mask of cold fury and disbelief. "Well, well," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "The crazy lady with her lame birds. How did you know?" She met his gaze. "I listened." Hemlock dismounted, his movements stiff with rage. He walked to the edge of the cistern and peered down, and then looked back at her, his lips curling into a sneer that was part of his old condescension, but now sharpened with desperation. "This is an old survey cistern. County property." It was not. The deed maps were clear. The boneyard was hers, rocks, dust, and all that lay beneath. "It's on my land, Mr. Hemlock," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Land you swindled from your dying father." The cruelty of the lie was meant to sting, to throw her off balance. She simply stood her ground, the rope for the bucket coiled in her hands. She was no longer the girl who flinched at the town's judgment. "He left it to me. A woman can't manage a resource like this," he said, shifting tactics. "It needs to be controlled for the good of the community. I'll give you $200 for it, right now, cash." $200. A fortune yesterday, an insult today. The water in that cistern was worth 1,000 times that. To him and his dying herd, it was the price of his survival, and he was offering her pocket change. The arithmetic was simple. He saw her as he had always seen her, alone, weak, and easily cheated. "No, thank you," she said. His face darkened. "Don't be a fool, girl. You can't guard a well by yourself. Someone could get hurt. Accidents happen in a dry season." The threat hung in the air, thick and ugly. What he did not yet know was that his power, the power of a wealthy man in a poor town, had evaporated with the last of the creek water. His threat was the lowing of a dying bull. At that moment, the Miller family appeared, walking up the track from their farm. Mr. Miller held the empty bucket Tom had brought home. He was a proud man, and his face was etched with the humiliation of having to ask for help, especially from the woman they had all pitied. He stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes on Elara, ignoring Hemlock completely. "Ma'am," he began, his voice cracking with emotion. "The boy, he said you had water to spare. We can pay. Not much, but we'll pay what we can." This was the moment, the pivot on which her entire future and the future of the town would turn. Greed or generosity, profit or people. She looked from Mr. Miller's proud, frightened face to Hemlock's twisted mask of envy. The choice was not hard at all. Elara turned her back on Hemlock, a dismissal more profound than any angry words. She walked to Mr. Miller. "The first 2 buckets for every family are free," she said, her voice carrying in the still, hot air, "to get you through the day. After that, it's 5 cents a bucket. You can run a tab until the rains come." The price was so low it was practically a gift. It was enough to value the water and her labor, but not enough to ruin anyone. It was a price of community, not of opportunism. Mr. Miller stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had come expecting to be turned away or gouged, and he was being met with a grace he had done nothing to deserve. Tears welled in his eyes. He just nodded, unable to speak. Hemlock let out a strangled cry of outrage. 5 cents? Are you insane? You're sitting on a fortune. I'll pay you 25 cents a bucket. 30. He was bidding against a ghost, against a version of Elara that no longer existed. She didn't even look at him. She lowered the bucket into the cistern, the rope whispering over the stone edge, and began to draw water for the Millers. The act was a declaration. The water was not a commodity to be hoarded by the rich. It was a lifeline to be shared by a community. By evening, the news had spread through Cinder Creek like a grass fire. A slow, steady procession of families made their way to the boneyard. They came not with the gawking curiosity of the early days, but with a quiet, humbled reverence. They brought buckets, barrels, and washtubs. They lined up, their faces grim with worry, and waited their turn. Elara worked tirelessly, her arms aching, drawing bucket after bucket. Tom Miller stayed by her side, helping to guide the ropes, his small face set with a new and solemn purpose. He was no longer just a boy watching from the fence. He was part of it. Mrs. Gable arrived not with a bucket, but with a basket containing a fresh loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a jar of apple butter. She set it down beside Elara. "The land provides for those who provide for others," she said, her smile as warm as the setting sun. She looked at the line of neighbors, at the fat, contented turkeys wandering among them, at the dark, life-giving hole in the ground. "They listen with their feet, eh, child?" Elara, her face smudged with dust and her hands raw, finally smiled back. A real smile, one that reached her eyes. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "They surely did." The town was saved, not by the wealthiest man, not by the town council, but by the stubborn patience of a woman they had dismissed and the instinct of 90 lame birds they had laughed at. The fortune inversion was complete. Hemlock was ruined, his rage turning to a bitter, impotent despair as he watched his neighbors find salvation at the one place he had been so certain was worthless. His cattle died, and with them, his standing in the community. He was exposed not as a leader, but as a predator, outwitted by a flock of turkeys and the quiet arithmetic of kindness. The drought broke in September, a soft, steady rain that soaked into the grateful earth for 3 straight days. The wells refilled, the creek began to run, and the land slowly healed. But the cistern on Elara's farm remained the heart of the town, a monument to the dry year. Elara never raised her price. Her turkey and egg business thrived, her reputation for fairness and quality spreading through the county. She was no longer Elara Vance, the woman alone. She was simply Elara of the boneyard, the woman who had listened to the land, and in doing so had taught a whole town how to survive.